important, I would like to introduce everyone to Sanam Emami. But first, as normal, I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape people, and we offer this land acknowledgement as a way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous peoples who have lived and who are still present on the land on which we now work and live. Thanks for joining us as usual. And as you know, the Clay Studio is dedicated to making art and inspiring people. If you'd like to help support our programming, including these free lunch and learn programs, please consider making a donation. And I'm going to drop that link in the chat for all of you. Sanam Emami is a ceramic artist and an associate professor of pottery at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. She earned a BA in history from James Madison University in Virginia and an MFA in ceramics from New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University. She was a visiting assistant professor in ceramics at Alfred University, resident artist at the Archie Bray Foundation in Montana, and has lectured at the Office for the Arts at Harvard University, the Kansas City Art Institute, Arizona State University Art Museum Research Center, and in Sika in Louisville, Kentucky. She received a New York Foundation for the Arts grant for craft, and her work has been in exhibitions at numerous galleries across the country, including the Society of Arts and Crafts Boston, Greenwich House Pottery in New York City, the Art Stream Nomadic Gallery, Northern Clay Center in Minnesota, and yes, the Clay Studio here in Philadelphia. I just wanted to read two little excerpts from her artist statement, if you don't mind, Sanam. My pots and tiles are made with a specific intent, a function. Plates, cups, and tiles are ubiquitous, recognizable. The vases and their multiple spouts are curious when empty. When filled with flowers, their function is revealed. The tile is a background or canvas. The cup provides a counterpoint. The curves and movement of the form interact with the surface pattern and imagery. The parameters of the functional pot simultaneously create boundaries and endless possibilities. As a student, I was drawn to ceramics for its apparent connections with and veneration of women's work, in quotes. The deep history of clay seemed to reveal connections between women and the material, taking shape in depictions of domestic rituals and ancient fertility goddesses. This history of ceramics and its connection with slow, methodical work, less visible yet necessary for the survival of societies, has often been marginalized to the more dominant narratives of ceramics in 20th century art, one of heroic virtuosity and singular objects. Thanks for letting me read that. I just think it's so important, and I love those parts of your artist statement. They really ring true with me as well. Welcome to Lunch and Learn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody.
Yay. As I mentioned in some of our emails about this, we are excited that Sanam is also acting as our guest juror for the next phase of our resident artist program. Each year we invite someone to come and help us make the decision of who to invite into the program, and it's a really important aspect to have an outside voice. And I think this year Sanam and I have talked about the fact that we're really within the program, we want to make sure that we have a vast array of different kinds of ceramic artists, and the fact that she is so thoughtful about her functional work and it is so beautiful and exquisite, really. We wanted to make sure people knew that we want functional potters to apply. So that was, I'm sorry, you're our standard bearer for functional potters in the resident program. So I'm going to start with our basic, maybe it's not basic, our usual question, which is how and why did you make the brave decision to make your life in art?
Well, I think that I thought about, I think I can give you like a succinct answer now that maybe sounds like it was pretty straightforward and linear, and one thing led to the other. Although at the time, I don't know if it was a conscious decision. I think it was more of a maybe visceral or intuitive, like I'm just going to try this out and see where it takes me. I mean, it's so interesting how I remember these things, but I will just to give you a little background. I think you mentioned in the introduction that my undergraduate degree was in history, and I never really thought that one could be an artist. I didn't have artists as models or mentors growing up. Although our house was filled with these amazing art objects that I was always really interested in, that my parents had brought with them from Iran. Just a few things that I noticed were most Iranian families had something that they had brought with them. And that always felt different than going to other families' houses. But when I was in university, I took an art class, and I still didn't really think that this would be a career, but I know that it really resonated with me. And I really tried to do different things with my life. Like I tried to have different careers, and I graduated from school. I did different internships. I thought about social work. I thought about maybe working in a gallery or in a museum. I thought about being a historian. I really tried a bunch of different things, but I just kept coming back to clay and to ceramics. So when I was about 24, life is so strange. A classmate of mine from school came to visit me. I was living in San Francisco, and she said, let's go see the Peter Voulkos retrospective at the Oakland Museum. And I didn't even know that that was happening, because I really hadn't stayed connected to the ceramic field since I graduated. And then after going to the museum, we ended up going to the Bay Area and seeing all these amazing ceramic artists that I didn't even know were there. We visited Sandy Simon and Bob Brady's studio, Trax Gallery. And then we visited this wonderful potter, Mary Law, and she just mentioned that she was looking for a studio assistant. So it really wasn't, I don't think I was looking for that, but she said that she was looking for a studio assistant. And I really feel like that was this moment. I was 24 and I started working for her part-time, and it just seemed like slowly my life went more and more and more towards working in clay. And then I went back to school, and yeah, that's sort of how it happened. But I teach in a university, and I meet students all the time who knew they were going to be artists in like high school or earlier. And I'm always so amazed by that, because I didn't know that. I didn't really know that till my mid 20s, that's really the thing I wanted to do. The other thing I just want to mention is that I didn't choose art because it came naturally to me. I think I chose it because it was the only place that I could really kind of dive in and get lost in what I was doing. And that felt really important to me.
Getting in the flow.
Yeah, where everything else disappears, you lose track of time, and you're just doing this thing. And it just felt like that was where I wanted to be. Then convincing my family was a whole different thing.
Yeah, and that's an important, that sometimes that's the brave part, right? How you can go to your family and tell them something that they might not think is that they didn't think of as the path. So there still seems to be, was it when you're working for Mary Law and you're there, that's when you decided to go to grad school for ceramics, or what was that timeline? Because you had to.
Yeah.
So you're telling us how you kind of like eased into it, but there must have still been like a decision moment when you said like, okay, it's not just this thing that I do that I really enjoy, it's what I want to do for my career.
Well, I should just add two things to this. And I think, I don't know if anyone is on the Zoom call whose family is an immigrant family, but, my family came to the States when I was 10, and I don't know, it's interesting thinking about how to explain to them that this was something that one could do. I think I really thought a lot about that. But the other thing I should mention is that when I was in college, my mom got sick and passed away. And I think that's where the bravery came from, maybe, because I just realized that life was short and I didn't know, like, well, I think most of my peers in college, you sort of have this idea that life goes on indefinitely and you're sort of immortal and you don't think about things like death and dying. And I think that for me, 3 or 4 years later, I was still processing it. And I thought, oh, I could just keep working on a job or a career that, you know, supports me. But if I wasn't engaged in it, what does that, how will I feel if, you know, I don't live? I don't know. It's something about the idea that life was short and, finite as opposed to infinite, I think is the thing that helped me decide. The other thing was that when I went to work for Mary Law, she was so lovely. She taught, and I think this is another thing I like to talk about, is that every artist I know comes up with a way of making it work, right? Like, how do I pay the bills and so that I can keep doing what I'm doing? And she had this lovely studio in Berkeley, but she taught 2 days a week at a community college. And so those 2 days a week, she had me come in her studio. And however many hours I worked for her, making things for her to sell, I could make my own work. And I think that what happened was that I just got really, really excited about what I wanted to make and didn't feel like I had enough time to do it while I was also working full time in San Francisco. And so after about 3 years, I called my undergraduate professor, who had generously said, whenever you're ready to do this, call me. His name is Brooke Levan, and he's actually not an art. Well, he's a artist now, but he runs this incredible place called Sustainable Settings. And long story short, he helped me put a portfolio together. And I was definitely not ready for grad school at all. I ended up doing a post-bac program. And then I worked for a year at the home of Matthew Metz and Linda Sikora, just making pots every day. Then I went to the Bray, then I went to grad school. So it took me 3 or 4 years to really, I had so much to learn. I was so green and I just needed time to figure out what I wanted to make and what my work was before I kind of landed in grad school.
Well, and it's so great and feels a little bit like a more historic apprenticeship situation, especially because you had mentors who were, giving you the space and time to do what you needed, but also you could watch them working, and I'm sure they were, helping you technically as you were progressing through that time period. But and it was brave that you just gave yourself that time. That's another thing with, you were saying that you knew that life wasn't infinite, but there are some people, I think, who would take that to feel that they had to rush to do whatever was next. And it's almost like, it's not infinite, but you also knew that it needed to be meaningful. So you gave yourself the time to get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Along with that, like the fact that you came to the US when you were 10.
Mm-hmm.
So you're, as a college student, I think on top of this, I'm so sorry to hear that you lost your mother that young. You had these 2 huge transitions in your life before you were 25, which is like not what most people experience. Which I think would also, add to this idea that your family moved away to probably find a better life, right? So you had the experience of like doing something dramatic to make your life the way you wanted it to be and kind of choose that for yourself, maybe. I don't know. What do you think about the immigration process and how that has affected your desire to be an artist?
I think, I don't know, I thought about a few different things when you were talking. One thing I do think was a real gift of my journey, and this is something I just did without really. I think that one thing I really needed to succeed as an artist, and I think that a lot of artists, was just really interesting. I think the idea of, like, I thought about this in my writing and in my work, but I think one of the gifts of my early childhood experience was that I didn't have the same connection to place as a lot of people do. So I had this more nomadic background. And I think that the gift of that was that it gave me, later on, I realized it gave me this material and content for what I wanted to explore in my work. But I also think the idea of living like a nomad, I really think that although I was incredibly fortunate and I had incredibly generous mentors and people that helped me along the way, I think I didn't have roots anywhere. And so I was just willing to go to the next thing and the next thing. And, you know, so for a number of years, I saw it as like a really amazing opportunity. Everything fit in my car, and I would just drive somewhere and do something for a year, then pack up my car again and go somewhere. And I think that's really what I needed and what helped me go from one thing to the next. So it's interesting. I mean, I sort of feel like that was one of the gifts of moving so much as a young person and moving from, you know, culture to culture. But the other thing that's so interesting is that my sisters had the same experience as me, but that didn't translate for them in the same way. But I think the other thing about moving when you're quite young and moving from, you know, Iran, we moved to England, and then from England, we moved to the States. I think I was just often on the outside. And so I was just observing things. And I think that also has been a helpful skill to have as an artist. But it's super interesting what tools we end up tapping into to kind of help us find our way. And I think now I don't know if I would have that courage. Like, I'm like, how did I just do that in my 20s? And I think part of it was I didn't overthink it. I think I just was like, I want to do this. This feels right. And so I would just go. But I also had a lot of incredible support and mentors that were really, really, I think, crucial to me being successful.
Yeah. And having mentors is lucky, and it's something to be grateful for. But it also, I think I've realized over the years that it's about you too, you being open to it. And the best mentorships, I think, happen when the mentee is giving something back too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it can be a really wonderful relationship. I think I understand that more maybe now that I'm a little older, that there's value in having had that there's value in yourself, that you were able to like attract these people who wanted to help you, right?
Right. No, I think you're right. I think there's a reciprocity there that now that I'm a teacher, I can see that it is
Symbiotic.
both parties have to participate, because you can't, and you really feel it when you know there's a student that really wants to do it, right? And you just want to figure out how to help them get to the next thing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's something to feel good about. And I love also that you said, as an Iranian family, always having objects that you had brought with you, and that as a history major first, which is the same, that was my first degree as well. The idea that culture is movable, but that objects are important, is something that I don't think everybody in our contemporary culture has that same experience, especially with things being kind of disposable and also ubiquitous, like the idea that you can go anywhere in the world and find a Starbucks or a Gap or whatever, that something that was so precious from Iran had to be had to be
Yeah.
brought along in order to be saved and savored. Like you couldn't get that same thing here. Maybe helped you understand that an object that you have made, one for function, one that is beautiful, can really be powerful in someone's life.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that helped me when I look back at things historically. I think ceramics is such a great um, material for embodying that. But I mean, there's lots of materials that do. They're just not. They don't survive necessarily over centuries. But just that thing you're describing, like historically as well, people traded goods and objects moved from culture to culture, and how that ended up influencing other cultures. So it wasn't just language and books, but it was also objects that really influenced and sort of helped cultures either clash or have more harmony or whatever. But the objects are this really interesting record, I think.
Yeah.
And I think in my work and also in the ceramic objects I was interested in learning more about, they're often multiple cultures have sort of contributed to the style or to the object taking shape or coming to life. And I think that I didn't really think about any of that with the things that we had in our home, but later I realized that, oh, for this object to have, you know, been able to be fabricated and to be decorated in this way, it took all these people and it took all this knowledge and it took all this time. And all of that I think is so interesting. As you just look at something and you think, oh, that's so interesting. That like, I mean, I think as a kid, I always looked at things and I wanted to know, well, not only who made them, but where did they come from and how did this happen? And I think that was really a compelling question that I started asking as a young person. I think I still think about that a lot. But your point about modern objects, I mean, I think like you said, I think things are ubiquitous, but it's so interesting. I think people still feel very connected to those things. But it's so interesting how we fabricate things in this range of ways now. There's just so many ways things can get made. And I know my students often ask, like, well, why are we still making pots? We don't need them. And I love that question. I mean, it's a big one and we talk about it in a lot of different ways, but I love, just asking them that when we do make things that are functional, like, well, what is this for you and why is it here? And how would that question be different if you lived in a culture that really valued and talked about those things, So I think you're right. They want to do it, but they don't often have the language for why they want to do it. And so that's fun to sort of unpack that.
Yeah, that's such an important conversation to have as people are becoming adults and understanding the world around them a little better, and kind of it helps them understand that the choices that they make also impact the world around them.
Mm-hmm.
And that making a choice to make something yourself and value it can pay dividends, I mean, for the rest of your life, and that buying something that you're going to throw away in a week is also affecting the world around you in a way that's important to understand. What you said a moment ago about looking at an object and being able to think about who made it, but also the knowledge it took to make that thing. And then we can also think about who used it. And I think about reading objects and that becoming understanding cultures, or reading objects allows people from different cultures, like you were saying, also to for us to see the common humanity among us.
Yeah.
So that's
I think
lovely.
I think that's ultimately like why I think I don't know. I have often thought, just going back to that first question you asked, but I think we become artists for lots of reasons. But I think this thing about sharing something and connecting with other people, I think some people, their strengths lie in doing that through language or through some other means. But I think artists make things to share what they're feeling or their observations about the world, or to highlight something they think is beautiful. And I think that's, and our shared humanity, which isn't like, you can't say, okay, here's a cup, here's our shared humanity. But then you kind of, like, that's what you're trying to do every day in the studio, is like make something that will connect with someone, that will resonate with them, that, it's just a really interesting idea. I think when I was younger, I had this really idealistic notion that, okay, art can really make the world somehow ... a better place, a more democratic place. And I don't know that I see it in that kind of, with that clarity now. I think I see it, that I still feel that way, but I think it's probably more subtle, and it's more, but this thing about sharing something, or shared humanity, or connecting with another human being who responds to something you made, it's a really powerful experience or emotion. And I think that is part of why artists do what they do, not necessarily because they're going to change the world, but because they want to connect.
But connecting, I think it's agreeing with everything you're saying. And I think it is empathy. We're building empathy, and we're teaching an artist who is attempting to make a connection is also putting out this energy into the world that they want to be connected. And that creates the space for empathy to grow. And that is what it really is, what we need to make the world a better place. So I do, although it is both abstract, as you were saying, it's abstract, but it's also very real, because with how much negativity can be put into the world, the attempt to put positivity and empathy is what is needed to counteract the negativity, as we are talking here on January 6th.
Yeah.
1 year from what happened last year. So we could keep talking like this for a lot longer, but I do want people to see your artwork. So I'm going to share my screen. Sorry about the cat presence. I can't help it.
I love the way the tail is like kind of blending in with your hair.
Yeah, she's not too obtrusive, but if I try to get her to not get on my lap, that's when the problems start. So we're just gonna let her do what she wants. Okay. Well, I couldn't help putting these images in because I was looking for some object images of Sanam's, and I found this great, I think 2015 workshop done with Matthew Metz, who you were just mentioning, in the back classroom upstairs in what will soon be called the old building. And we thought we'd start with some of the older work. I've lost you here. There you are. On the left, 2007, and on the right, 2009. Do you want to talk a little bit about this earlier work?
I'll just say that in graduate school, I was really kind of searching for a form that would kind of be really rooted in a specific function, but give me like a sort of a form that I could play with in terms of its sculptural possibilities. And I saw a historical tulip vase in a really lovely museum in San Francisco. And I basically spent the last year of grad school really trying to study the historical tulip vase and trying to understand like what were the things that had to happen historically for the tulip vase to be made in Holland in the 17th century. And I realized that I really didn't know that. I just thought tulips were Dutch, and that tulips really, because they're so synonymous with Holland. And in my research, I discovered that tulips actually originated in Central Asia and were first cultivated by the Turks. And it was a Viennese ambassador who actually like stole the bulbs and smuggled them to Europe. And then, tulips became a European flower. But I love that the blue and white of the traditional Delftware really was rooted in the history of the Silk Road. I love that the tulip originally came from the Middle East. And so I also love that tulips were the first bull market in history. And so there's this really interesting object that is both compelling, or flower, that artists have studied, economists have studied, historians have studied. And I just loved all of that. And then I started making tulip vases, and I wanted to really make the forms, sort of bring the tulip back to the Middle East. And so I started making these tulip vases that were inspired by Islamic and Iranian architecture. And so I was looking at, minarets and different kinds of buildings and structures that could be the foundation. So I think my grad school work was probably more architectural. I think these were made after grad school, a few years after. And I think I was starting to want to make them a little bit more like a vase or a tableware. But I've always loved that when you look at them from the top or look at them from the bottom and look out, you sort of feel like I felt when I was standing in a mosque and looking up at the ceiling. So there's these, these layers, and then the patterns are all patterns that I sort of have seen or identified that were patterns that were developed along the different cultures along the Silk Road. So the forms changed over the years, but that was kind of the background behind them. And I love that, when they didn't have flowers in them, people were just engaged in them in this way that was really interesting. It was more like, what is it? And then when they had flowers in them, people were engaged, but they weren't really asking what it was. They were just engaged because they were like, oh, it holds flowers. So I really like the forms for that reason. There's a lot of just layers with the tulip vases that I can play with.
Yeah, there are not many things that have quite that much reverberation into, like you were saying, all these different fields: horticulture, economy, history, all that. Erica asked if the bowls are attached. They're probably not attached, right? The bowl and the top section are separated.
They are separated, yeah. And after making them for a few years, I realized that I wasn't doing this at first, but after some prototypes and after my thesis show, I started making the bottoms open so that, they actually needed each other. So the bottom part holds the water, and then the top part holds the flowers.
Oh, so they needed each other. That's nice. These are images of a show called Garden Feast of Paradise that was at Ensika and then came to the Clay Studio, curated by Dominique Ellis and all of you together, Sanam,
and
Ibrahim Saeed was also in the show. So this is such a different visual image, both from those tulip vases and then what we're going to see next. So do you want to talk a little bit about what this means?
Yeah, I think, Anat and I had been talking for a long time. Anat Shifton is this wonderful artist originally from Israel. And her and I met at a show a few years before this collaboration started, and started talking a little bit about some of the things we had talked about earlier, Jen, about, well, you know, in the Middle East, you sort of see how people identify as really different, you know, different people, different communities. And yet we're probably more similar than we are different. And we wanted to have an exhibition with artists from the Middle East, but from a range of backgrounds, or artists whose work was inspired by Middle Eastern art. And what was really kind of lovely about this show was that we were really trying to not just have a theme and then have everybody make their own work, but how to make the work feel like it was part of a specific show. And so I sort of suggested this idea that, well, what if we use the garden as sort of the overarching theme? And, you know, in Iranian and in Islamic culture, gardens are very symbolically powerful, literally powerful. And this concept of the Garden of Paradise, which is a complex question, especially for someone who's like me, who's not religious, but it offered this really beautiful framework for how each of us could create a part of a garden and how the garden could be connected. So the overview was a tile broken down into different shapes, those wooden platforms. And then each artist created their own version of a garden. And my contribution was actually based on this beautiful, it's an aerial view of a garden, of the king's garden in Esfahan. And Esfahan used to be the capital of Iran. And Shah Abbas, at the height of his empire, created this incredible architecture, but this garden. And Iranians used to say, Esfahan Nesfa Jahan, which is Esfahan is half the world. And it was this really magical, prosperous land, just city, I should say. And I was able to go back and visit Esfahan about 10 years ago. But this is a very abstracted aerial view of the main gardens. And I just gave myself permission in a way that I don't normally with my work. So there's some pieces that are cardboard. There's pieces that started out as test tiles. It's an idea that I would very much like to revisit. So hopefully one day it's something I'd like to have another go at, to create this garden.
Well, you never know. Maybe, maybe that could be in Philadelphia. Here's another of the early, I think this is from the show that you and Linda and Matthew had together at the Clay Studio.
Yeah. And I sometimes in these talks, I'm really glad you showed this image too, because I think, although I love making the tulip vases and I do make these other pieces periodically, I think tableware is the really core of my practice. And so this is a good example. My earlier work was salt-fired stoneware, cone 10. And I actually haven't made work at that temperature or fire. I haven't fired this way in a long time, but on my last sabbatical, I made this at the Northern Clay Center during a residency. And it was really fun to go back to atmospheric firing, high fire. So this was probably 7 or 8 years ago that I made this one.
It's so, there's something so compelling about the, salt fire and the simple forms, and just it's so viscerally attractive. I don't know how else to say that.
Well, one day, that's another thing I really want to go back to. But this is a great example of the work I'm making now, where I'm firing in a cone 6 oxidation. That's the kiln. But then I'm actually trying to add these layers to give that sense of depth and that brushwork that you saw in the picture.
Yeah. And here it is together.
Yeah, and these
Together.
are the most recent tulip vases I've made, and it was interesting. I don't think it was conscious, but as I kind of kept making vases every couple of years, the forms have gone really much more towards the traditional Delft form. So these are really in the pattern is really based in Islamic and the Islamic culture and the Silk Road, but the form is much more traditional Delft.
Mm.
But then I made, instead of using the white, making it look like white clay, I made this. I really wanted to highlight the chocolate brown clay, which just for me, I don't think anyone would necessarily need to know, but Botger, who is the German essentially the German who discovered the secret to porcelain under imprisonment.
Yeah.
Ludwig. Yeah, such a great story, right? The Arcanum. But he discovered porcelain, but he also developed this smooth chocolate brown clay. And that's what this is kind of referencing, that kind of really beautiful, smooth, dark clay that you'll often also see Meissen things being made out of.
And then with blue and white still, but on top of the chocolate brown.
Yeah. And then this is really recent work. This was just made last year at a show at the Harvey Preston Gallery in Aspen. And this is a kind of a centerpiece or a garniture set.
Yeah. And the tray is reminiscent of what was in the Garden Piece to Paradise.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are 2 large jars that were also part of that Harvey Preston show, with sort of patterns and sort of motifs from along the Silk Road. And the whole show I was kind of playing with this idea of patterns that are more arabesque and more floral and fluid, and then patterns that are more geometric.
That word arabesque, it's such a great word that, until I was in college as a history major, but in Spain, looking at the southern Spain, sort of looking at Moorish art, I didn't understand that the word arabesque meant Arab. I mean, I went to dancing school as a little girl and understood it as something that my teacher said that I was supposed to make my body look like. And then it's a word that has so many meanings and it's so layered, just like all this. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
No, I think that's so important to say that, because I think you're right. I think we often hear this, we sort of figure out how the word fits within our culture and our experiences, which is a very human thing. But then, that, you understand that sort of historian impulse, like, or that moment where you're like, oh, like all these light bulbs go off, and then you're like, oh, the word has all this other meaning and history. And yeah, these are some tiles. These are actually from a few years ago, a show that I did with Dell at the gallery, but at that time it was the Harvey Meadows Gallery. And this is a fun series. I think I do a lot of work with stencils, and I think this was the beginning of me thinking about not just the stencils themselves, but the sort of space between the stencils. I always had these scraps left over from when I was making my work. And I think the tiles kind of gave me the space to really maybe deconstruct or let go of that sort of sense of order that we often associate with patterns. So creating a more, there is a pattern, but it's not necessarily repeated uniformly. It's, an interrupted pattern, or a play with positive and negative space.
And almost a visual representation of this idea we're talking about, with how things have layers of meaning, and there's a fragment of something layered on top of a whole something else, and
Mhm.
it's sort of, they're
Mhm.
almost, there's movement in these too, so they're all going in different directions, and
Mhm.
it's a bit of a more literal explanation of that. I think this is our last. Oh no, there's one more after this one.
And these are not stencils. These are kind of dark clay with slip, and then I've kind of transferred an image by hand, and then I'm just painting and carving back into them.
Mm.
I found this image of this building in what is now Pakistan, but of course historically, before Pakistan existed, um, was sort of one of the myriad stops along the Silk Road. And there's this beautiful building with these flowers, and they're described as imaginary flowers. And I just thought that was such a lovely description. So I started sort of playing with applying those imaginary flowers on these cups and garniture sets.
If they're not stencils, and yet you have the mirror images, you're playing with symmetry, even though you're
Hmm.
hand drawing them, which is
Yeah.
another kind of layer of meaning. Yeah. And across these we see similar shapes, but there's so much variation within the different kinds of work that you're making, and yet it all looks like your work.
Mm.
I see pink for the first time.
And matte glazes. I love the matte surfaces. It took a while to figure out how to um, have a palette of work that was matte alongside the shiny work, with the stencils, just trying to figure out how not to have them completely disappear. But that's the fun thing about using this glaze. It's all the same glaze.
Hmm.
It's just over different clay bodies and different slips and different thicknesses. But the stencils sometimes
Hmm.
sometimes they'll pop, and it all depends on the color of the stencil. So
And this one reminds me of the vellum glaze, which is the rookwood, the famous thing that
oh yeah.
rookwood pottery often did, which was to put that sort of a hazy glaze finish, so that it would feel
Oh,
very
interesting. Uh-huh.
kind of mysterious. Oh my gosh, there is one more. Anyway, this is the last image. You want to finish up talking about any other final comments about the pieces?
N-
This one again is like the negative spaces of the
mhm.
stencil.
That might have been one of the first like larger pieces that I played with that idea. Um, no, nothing to add. I think um, it's just interesting the way the image. I'm always like struggling and engaged with and critiquing the relationship of the form to the surface. I was just looking at that. I haven't seen these pieces in a while. Oh, I'd love to hear from if there are, any questions, or if we have time to hear from.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we have just maybe 5 more minutes if anyone has
Uh-huh.
questions, and we can you're welcome to put your question in the chat, or just take yourself off mute and ask away. Such a nice group today. Thanks everyone again for coming. Oh, there's Terry Solomon. Hi Terry. um Raymond. Raymond is showing us things in the chat.
I
Is
could
this
answer that
about...
one
Oh
question
yeah,
in
there you
the
go.
chat.
Mm-hmm.
I love that Laser Ray. Hi.
That's
Thank you
Raymond.
for
He's our
asking that
graphic designer.
question. Um, it's actually very much like the Yixing ware from China, because it's actually not a very plastic clay. It's very smooth and very short, but I love working with it. And I think that that's probably what actually, I have these. I actually got to go to Yixing with my mentor, Linda Sikora, and this brown clay that, is just local, that's their local clay. That's sort of why the Yixing, all of that, developed where it did, and then Jingdezhen with the porcelain. But that this very smooth dark clay is what the Yixing potters use. I don't know if that's what Botger was trying to imitate. It may have been because of the sort of obsession with things from China and the sort of fascination, but it is very, very similar. And I often think about that because sometimes students or people will say, oh, you're using chocolate brown clay, it must be more plastic. And it's actually not. It's very much like a dark brown porcelain or a dark brown white. It's like white clay that just has color in it.
So beautiful. Well, it doesn't look like we have other questions, but we have had a lovely hour that went by super fast as usual. Had a really deep and conversation that was memorable that we'll put up on our YouTube channel for anyone else who wants to watch it. And I just want to say thank you so much, Sanam.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for inviting me and for the great conversation. And thanks everybody for tuning, for whatever, connecting or being on the Zoom chat.
That's funny. Oh, we have a couple. Now we do have some just thank yous from people. Thanks. Interesting. Thanks, everybody. As I said, Sanam is going to be our guest juror. So look for who our new residents are going to be. That will be announced sometime in May, probably. But in the meantime, if you know anyone who might be interested in the program, please direct them to our website so they can apply. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Stay warm.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.